So before I begin, I'd like to recognize the indigenous people on whose land we congregate tonight, the tribes of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo peoples. You might be asking yourself what Veterans for Peace has to do in the United States with Zionism, or you might not. But I'm going to tell you anyway, because it is seemingly a good question. So of course we all know that Israel is very far from the United States. It's all the way, actually the name is too big to even place it on the map. I'm sure you know where it is. It's right, oh, it is. The name is on Egypt. Okay, so you can see Israel right there. Well, firstly, I'm a veteran of the Israel Defense Force, which is a misnomer, but we'll get to that later. I'm probably the only IDF member of Veterans for Peace, like Gene said. I served for 3 years as a medic in the paratroopers and an armored vehicle driver, and I can say pretty confidently today that I'm ashamed of my service, and would take it back if I could, but I can't, so I do what I can. Secondly, not only is the United States involved in the goings-on in the region in general, but I hope you leave tonight with the notion that Zionism can be viewed as a model for settler colonialism, which is what is going on in the United States up until today. And Zionism is an excellent model, not only for what has happened here, but it sets precedents for what our president does. And I brought an example. So, Trump says U.S. military may fire on migrants who throw rocks. Well, this kind of looked very familiar to me as somebody who's a nut for Israeli news. As you may know, there's been the Great March of Return in Gaza for 32 consecutive weeks. The Israeli military has been firing on unarmed, nonviolent protesters and killing children and women and men. And Israel definitely sets precedents in the quote-unquote Western world and in the United States for how the military can respond. So my talk today will integrate some of my passions, which is neuroscience, and how the brain actually works in both victim and aggressor. So I'm very interested in bullying behavior, in aggression, and that kind of interplay between fear and anxiety and aggression, and how it works with the models of settler colonialism, white supremacy, which is on the rise all over the world, and Zionism as an example of that. So I'll start with some terminology, and we'll see that we're all on the same page. By the way, I ask that you reserve your questions to the very end, okay? So I can go through it, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So what are the origins of Zionism? And is Zionism Judaism? That's a question that everybody seems to be a little bit confused about. So Zionism and notions of Zionism are actually predate the Jewish version all the way back to the 16th century, to the Protestant Reformation. And were popular among Puritans in England who transported it to the United States. It gained traction among Jews in the late 19th century, mostly in Russia, but also in what's called Western Europe, especially in Germany. And in Russia, in what's called the shtetls, which were Jewish towns, enclaves, pretty segregated from their surroundings, many Jews were victimized in those times to a lot of violence in that area. And the Jews were secular there, but not emancipated, which is a different situation than the Jews in the West, which were already emancipated. So in essence, if you weren't rich or able to find education or any kind of way out, you were faced with a big conundrum. How do you deal with the violence that is targeting you? So first of all, most of the Jews did not choose Zionism. Let's start with that. Most of the Jews decided to leave. So that we see that in the late 19th century, a lot of Jews left for most of the United States and Britain and other places as well. Then there was a big growth of the Bund, the Jewish socialist movement, and Jews were a very significant movement within the October Revolution. And then the third part chose Zionism. Around 50,000, which is not very many, emigrated to Palestine at that time. Okay, and these were hardcore, secular Zionists who were profoundly influenced by Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and the mentalities there. And we'll talk about it in a second. So their response to this violence was aggression. And terrorism became a tool that they developed. Okay, if you actually examine the first leaders in Israel, before it was Israel-Palestine, many of them were part of this culture of terrorism as they experienced it in Russia. This is by the way, comes from a lot of work by Professor Rabikin, who details the whole history of the development of Zionism, especially in Russia. He's an Orthodox Jew. So these Jews actually chose to invest in aggression as a form of coping with the violence that they endured, with the oppression and the bigotry, because there was a lot. This is the first of several theoretical slides that integrate neuroscience with some political science as well. You can see on the top left the threat, which is in our case, for example, anti-Semites who come after, for example, a shtetl and a group of Jews. So hundreds of years back, the common mentality of the religious Jews was not very much one of confrontation and fighting back. It was more of a kind of a divine acceptance. This is the will of God. But because these Jews were emancipated and secularized, they had a modern vision of what was going on. They could politically analyze, and they did not accept it as divine, as something they had to kind of accept with open arms. They fought back. So the first response was defensive aggression, and this is something that we could see in a lab when you actually look at any mammal. When you test mammals, the first response is usually flight if there's some kind of escape route, freezing if there isn't, and defensive attack if you're cornered. Okay, if you're cornered, you will threaten the person or the animal coming at you, and then you will lunge at them, clawing at their eyes, etc. This is a model that works with human beings as well. Usually what happens, it's true, you can see the same neural pathways as well. If you go to the top right, if you succeed in this strategy, there's a cessation of threat, and you go about your normal life. However, defensive aggression can also lead to a reward. Okay, and we all know this from, I know it from when I was just fighting with kids in school kind of thing. I think a lot of kids experience that kind of rush when you're able to defend yourself and you're successful at it, or ward off a bully. You can feel feelings of reward, which can be translated to a different kind of aggression, which is called offensive aggression. And this aggression is different from defensive aggression, in that its target is not the cessation of threat, but resource acquisition. Okay, now this is a new kind of aggression. And as you can see here, there's a connection, because what starts as defensive aggression can morph into offensive aggression. Okay, and just a hint towards the later parts of this lecture, the hegemonic structure reinforces this cycle and constantly raises the bar of permissible violence. Okay? So this macho, exclusivist, and nationalistic form of aggression was off-putting to most Western Jews. Okay, Zionism, again, like I stressed in the beginning, appealed to very few Jews in the beginning. Jews who enjoyed the rewards of emancipation and liberalism looked at it as a very barbaric mentality, a very messianic mentality. One dissident that I like to call Zionism's first dissident, his name is Moshe Menuhin, who is the father of the famous violinist And if we have time later, I can play an interview with him. He wrote a fantastic book called Not by Might Nor by Power, which I recommend. It's very early evidence of what was going on in the Zionist project. It speaks for itself. Okay, so notably Zionism was a fringe movement that appealed to few Jews. Most preferred to either emigrate, and about 1% went to Palestine, 50,000 people, as I stated. Zionists were in fact anti-Semites of sort. Why? Because they considered Judaism a race, not a religion, like anti-Semites do. They hated the local Jews in Palestine when they came there because they saw everything, they embodied everything they ran away from. A kind of pacifist attitude, multiculturalism, yeshiva study, and also working with the local regime. And they hated that. In contrast to these Palestinian Jews, they had a much more kind of fascistic, white supremacist outlook, which was on the rise in Europe at that time, nationalistic, romantic attitude that focused on developing an exclusivist homeland. So that's a little bit about Zionism, and of course we could do a whole lecture just about Zionism, but I just wanted to touch on the beginnings of it. White supremacy is a patriarchic, hyper-capitalist force that promotes the idea that people who are white are superior to others, as we all know from our president. It is an ideology that grew in influence during the 19th century in Europe, and it is based on merit, not on merit, but on force. Okay, and it's an inherently revisionist, anti-intellectual, tribalist, separatist movement, and we'll see the importance of these different definitions and how they relate to the neural models that I'm going to present to you, because it's important. This is how populations are controlled, in essence. Separatist movement that promotes loyalty, okay, to a contrived identity and privilege to its in-group and leader at the expense of equality and justice for all. Collectivism is villainized. Social Darwinism is hailed, of course, because you have to show that there is a reason that you are privileged, right? And syncretized to nationalist movements. White supremacy is anti-Semitic because Jews represent everything that is in contrast to it. The notion of global apartheid, because Jews are everywhere, okay? And they wanted to be emancipated. They wanted equal rights. They were leaders of social justice movements. They embraced the Enlightenment. And they were a major force in the October Revolution, as I stated. So they are presented by white supremacists and anti-Semites as both powerful and powerless parasites, and are essentially the enemy inside and out within a system of white supremacy. They serve white supremacy as their eternal scapegoats, meant to distract from ruling class corruptions. So this is Jews, not Zionists, and I make that differentiation a lot, and it's a very important one to make. When people enmesh those two terminologies, that actually plays into the wrong hands. Finally, I'll finish this part with a definition of settler colonialism, which is a very important definition, very important concept, which is a movement of people who were persecuted in Europe for economic, social, religious reasons, and were either forced or chose to leave. Okay, and we know about settler colonialist movements all over the world: United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, Palestine. But they all have the same problem, which is there's a native population. And what do you do with a native population? And what you do is always the same thing. You annihilate it. By different methods. It could be physically, it could be a segregation, like in South Africa, and it could be a destruction of culture. There's a lot of examples in Canada, for example, that they did that, and here as well. These genocidal practices are coupled with capitalism and an abuse of a workforce that consisted of indigenous people and many times imported slaves, like in the American example. Okay, so back to Palestine. We're done with the definitions. what are the means of white supremacist and settler colonialist oppression? Let's look at, I made a short list, and let's go one by one and try to see what we can actually learn from them. So here I'd like to discuss these by laying out some steps that are necessary to confront apartheid, inequality, and ethnic cleansing. I will go through them here, and then we can talk about each one separately. So the first one, that is a lot, everything is relevant to what's going on today in the United States, glaringly relevant. So the first one is that one must seize truth and narrative and fight propaganda. So this list, everything that is written on this list, if you take the inverse, it's what the white supremacist settler colonialist structure works towards. And this is what we have to do to work against it. Then the second thing is to promote accountability, and this is essential for a de-internalization of oppressive societal norms. Here there's a difference between structural racism and personal racism, which is something we need to constantly parse out and think about. And this is, again, extremely important, and we'll see how white supremacist settler colonialist structures work very hard to prevent their populations from holding themselves accountable, and the Zionist example is so perfect to demonstrate this. The third is to actually stop the hostility, inequality, and injustice, but it doesn't end here, right? If I were to name Veterans for Peace, for example, I would name it Veterans for Justice, because it doesn't end with peace. Because peace should never be the end game. It never stops there. In order for healing and reconciliation to happen, there has to be a formation of bonds. Okay? So yes, peace is important. It's important to stop the hostilities and the inequalities. But we have to break down barriers, which are physically, emotionally, psychologically built by the oppressors, and the other is always dehumanized. We have to promote leadership of the oppressed, and this refers to something that Kimberly Crenshaw defined as intersectionality, and we see actually the power of intersectionality with these midterm elections where black women and women of color were by far the most progressive constituency in the United States. And then finally, form bonds and the rehumanization of the other. By the way, any of these slides that you want, I can easily email to you or send to you, so don't have to worry about that. Okay, so we'll keep this up as we begin. Important to stress is that moving forward with any of these steps out of order doesn't work. Okay? If you skip truth and accountability and you just go to forming bonds, which is something that happened during the Oslo Accords, or adjacent to the Oslo Accords in the 90s, where there were a lot of these camps that sprung up where Palestinian youth and Israeli youth would come and would have a great time, and then they would go back to their segregated societies. It doesn't work. If you don't tackle, if you don't comprehend truth and tackle your accountability and work to stop the hostility and you break down the barriers and promote leadership, you can't form the bonds appropriately. There was just an article in Haaretz, the Israeli liberal Zionist newspaper, that came out yesterday, which was just a perfect example of this forming bonds, claiming that now that Miri Regev, who was the culture minister in Israel, now that she went to Qatar, I think it was? Abu Dhabi. Now that she went there, it's a sign that Israel is now going to be friends with the Arab world. And it was just really clueless. You can read it, it's up. But anyway, so the first step towards comprehending the situation, like I said, is to understand the truth. And for those of you, if there are any Zionists in the audience, this part may disturb you the most, because my truth is different than yours. What's referred to as a complex and complicated conflict is far from it, as I see it, and as actually the historical and the academic world consensus is. It is actually an oppressive relationship between an occupier and its victim, indigenous victim. And the Israelis, of course, are the occupiers and the Palestinians are the victim, and not from what's called the occupation of 1967, but from 1948 and before. So there is nothing complicated other than what is manufactured to be complicated. And this is exactly what I talk about when we talk about the hurdles that are placed by these systems. This is a hurdle that is placed to prevent people from comprehending the truth. They make it complicated, but it's not complicated. Okay? If you dig deep enough, if you go through the propaganda, you can actually figure out the truth relatively easy, at least nowadays. Maybe 50 years ago it wasn't that easy. So the first step is clarification as a recipe for determining truth, which will ultimately hold the aggressors accountable. So what is the truth? The collection of evidence on the history of Zionism and the events that led to the establishment of the State of Israel, including the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, is overwhelming. It included over 800,000 Palestinians and hundreds of villages, I'm talking about 1948, which were ethnically cleansed, which includes every horror that you can imagine. Okay? Just as a scientist doesn't need to prove Darwin or Newton or Hawking or whoever else with every article that they publish that relates back to this information, I don't feel that it's necessary for me to prove that this happened, because it did, and let's move on. Okay? So, as a political analyst, I rely on the work of these pioneers and historians. And the fact of the matter, as Ilan Pape says, the historian, there is no controversy in the academic world about this fact that I just stated. It's only about the morality of it. So there are some Zionist historians, like Benny Morris is a well-known one, who will argue about the morality of the decision. But that's a completely different argument than a lot of propagandists who would claim there was no ethnic cleansing, the Palestinians weren't there, it's a group that was brought there, and there's so many different stories. But that's complete, it's fake news, okay? And even if you don't agree to the terminology of ethnic cleansing, the fact of the matter is that they were never allowed to return. Okay? So if they were never allowed to return, it's a clear break with international law. And in addition, there's also no excuse for Israel's behavior today, which is practices of apartheid, continued ethnic cleansing, and the denial of rights and freedoms to millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, of course, but also within Israel proper. Okay, and I have an article here, if anybody's interested, I can mail you the link, where there's an actual chronological list of all the different laws that prejudice against Palestinians who live within Israel proper. Okay, so it's enshrined in law. The reason I don't rehash historical facts and discuss them to death, even though we've been talking about it for 10 minutes, but that's nothing, right? Is it, like I said, it takes time away from the next step. It promotes this anti-intellectual notion of fake news, whereby academically accepted facts are placed on an equal level with opinions, which annoys me to death. Just like with a doctor, you won't discuss, if I'm not a medical doctor and I come to a surgeon, I'm not going to say that my opinion is equal to theirs. They've done the work, they went to medical school. So if you do the work, let's talk about it. If you don't do the work, it's about propaganda, conversation over. And I think that's very important in today's kind of environment. It also cheapens the notion of freedom of speech to include oppressive and hate speech, and it legitimizes every opinion that a person has if you actually provide them this kind of platform. Okay, we'll get to this guy in a second. The ultimate propaganda goal, as I see it, and I can see it very well with my Israeli family and people I know, and when I think about myself in my earlier years, is a kind of fusion between the notion of self and the notion of nation. Okay, that's kind of the ultimate goal, and that's the reason why these kinds of meetings sometimes become so emotional. when Zionists feel a personal attack on themselves when people talk about the regime. This is the state with the regime, right? But the propaganda has worked so well that any attack on the regime becomes a personal attack. And that is a huge success of the Zionist propaganda. In fact, critics like B'Tselem, the executive director of B'Tselem, Haggai Elad, who was recently in the UN, he's not even that extreme the way I look at it. He still talks about the occupation of 1967, where I talk about 48 and the right of return. I think those are fundamental to talk about. But okay, let's say within the Israeli Zionist political map, he's considered left. This is how the Israeli UN ambassador reacted to Haggai Elad's speech in the Security Council. You might have seen this, it was on Democracy Now! Okay, this is Danny Danon's Twitter feed. I'll give you a little, well actually there's captions, so.
The world must let Israel know that it will no longer stand idly by, that it will take action against the continued dismantling of the Palestinian people. Members of the Security Council, you have spoken and you have gotten Israel's answer. Action must now follow. Thank you very much.
By bringing B'Tselem, Bolivia has in fact proven the strength of Israel's vibrant democracy. I challenge you all of you, to find a Palestinian or a Bolivian who could dare defame his government at the Security Council. At best, he might be thrown in jail, but he would more likely end up dead. מר אלעד, אתה אזרח מדינת ישראל שמשרת את האויבים שלנו. הם משתמשים בך נגדנו. חיילי צה"ל מגנים עליך, ואתה בא לפה ומכפיש אותם. תתבייש לך. תתבייש לך, משת"פ.
So I don't know if you were able to read the captions, but in English, Mr. Danon was very proud to say that Israel is an amazing democracy because, look, B'Tselem, a human rights organization, can you hear me?
Yes.
A human rights organization can come and speak at the UN Council. But then he changed to speak in Hebrew, and he said to the guy, shame on you, collaborator. Literally a few seconds later. So, I think it's a fantastic example. Him and Elad and Amy Goodman were kind of chuckling in the studio because it was just unbelievable. How does Israel succeed in this extremely successful propaganda that it has within its own population I'm talking about, okay? Within the state itself. Because there is very little dissent in Israel, a handful of people. First of all, this propaganda is from a very early age. Kids in kindergarten are already, shown pictures of a Palestinian, but it's a very stereotypical picture of a man with a kafia on a camel, drinking tea, and he's a bad guy, and the good guy has an IDF uniform, etc. This includes the media, the arts, and academia. Okay, academia is part of this, and Ilan Pape, the historian I mentioned earlier, wrote an entire book about this topic. It's the oil that greases class oppression, which is, I come from a socialist Marxist approach, and racism is definitely oil that greases the capitalist, white supremacist, settler colonialist, oppressive society. Number two, and this is huge, is obligatory military service. So every person is made an accomplice. Okay? You're 18 years old, you're not extremely, you don't know what's going on around you pretty much, you're a kid. And you're thrown into these situations and you don't really have defenses to deal with it. I'm not trying to excuse any behavior. I'm just saying this is how the minds are shaped and formed. There's this obligatory military service, and people would much rather maintain a fictitious narrative than to challenge themselves and to understand that the oppression and the abuse and the fact that they were manipulated into a certain kind of situation to serve a hegemony, to serve a ruling class, to serve expansionism at the expense of other people. And third, I highly recommend a book by Chris Hedges, which I spoke to you about, War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning, that talks about the cohesive nature of war, and it has an extremely strong propaganda value, especially in a society that's very broken up, that's a fusion of people from everywhere, like Israeli society. There really is not a lot in common between the Ethiopian Jew and the Russian Jew. Okay, so you eat latkes. Wow. But cohesion is war, and you can see that a lot of times when there's a huge amount of corruption in the government, so war is used as a distraction, or when there's social unrest, war is a solution. This fusion serves an additional purpose. As a logical extension, it is also used to villainize the opponent based on its leader, right? So, Yasser Arafat is a corrupt guy. We can't talk to the Palestinians. They need to have Gandhi leading them. Now it's Hamas. Hamas are so extremists. We can't talk to them, etc., etc. So you use that kind of fusion to villainize your enemy. And of course, I'm not talking. I will later talk about this, but of course, Israel has persecuted, jailed, killed, tortured, banned, exiled most of the Palestinian leadership. Right, the leadership that we do see are the ones that were allowed to take these positions of power. And I highly recommend a movie called Naila and the Uprising, talking about a spontaneous, grassroots, nonviolent, women-led movement during the First Intifada, very inspirational. And it was crushed by various forces. So I'm going to speak about 3 fallacies, and then we'll move on with that list. So the first fallacy is that Zionism is Judaism, and this we hear a lot. And the extension of that is that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And of course, this is a fallacy. If you challenge Israeli apartheid and Zionist policies, it's not like you're challenging Judaism at all. Like I said, Zionism itself has anti-Semitic attributes to it, and in a second I'll demonstrate it. Just like challenging Saudi Arabia's policies doesn't mean that you're challenging Islam. It's the same kind of equivalent. Also, the hypocrisy here is staggering because Zionists promote anti-Semites like Trump or Bannon or Orban of Hungary or Duterte or Bolsonaro of Brazil now, and because they have a mutual interest. And what is that mutual interest? Well, it's called global apartheid. The whiteys in the whitey countries, the blackies in the blacky countries, the Jews in Israel. Okay, so the anti-Semites want the Jews out. Israelis, come to Israel. We need you to fight the demographic threat, the Palestinian womb. Right? This is the sickness, in essence. And I was going to go to that guy that you saw. Here you go. Here is he's not the opposition's chief, but he's a senior member of the opposition, the left-wing opposition, and he says that the shooting in Pittsburgh should teach Jews to come to Israel. That's the conclusion that he reached, and this is the left-wing opposition in Israel. So as you can see, this works very well with the white supremacist anti-Semitic narrative. Okay, the second fallacy is that Zionism is not colonialism, but a national liberation movement, except perhaps Zionism started that way, but the second they chose Palestine as the goal, there were native people there. finished being a liberation movement and began being a settler colonialist movement. And the understanding of Zionism as a settler colonialist movement is essential because that opens the door for alliances with other groups, indigenous, black and brown, immigrant, etc. All these other groups who are victims of the same kind of oppression. The third fallacy that I'll mention is that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. But in fact, Israel is not a democratic state, as I mentioned before, nor is it a Jewish state. It is only Jewish by supremacy. Okay, so there is not really something Jewish about it, except the fact that you are supreme in Israel-Palestine. I see that we're running a little late, so it might take a little bit more than an hour. So you'll have to forgive me for that. I want to play a short video.
This Truth Commission was different from other countries. This one was public.
It was a week of high drama at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission this week.
The stories poured out on television and radio in several of South Africa's 11 official languages. The truth could no longer be denied.
And a stick was put inside your knees and you had to stretch your knees. During that period, you were suffocated.
Fine, don't worry about it.
I thought I knew the awfulness of apartheid. But you see, when it ceases to be statistics, and it is a real, live human being who says this, that, and the other happened, that devastates you.
That was the moment. That was the moment that we all stopped in our tracks and looked back and said, what have we done?
For 2 years, Max Dupree reported on the hearings for South African Broadcasting.
This Truth Commission is about the people of this country. It's not about the deal that the politicians made. It's not about the Truth Commissioners or politicians. It's not about justice. It's not even about perpetrators and victims. It is about the people of this country making peace with their past.
What I would really, really like is, I would like to meet that man that threw the grenade in an attitude of forgiveness and hope that he could forgive me too.
I would love to know who killed my father, so would my brother, I suppose. Because it's very hard for us right now to do anything. We do want to forgive, but I mean, we don't know who to forgive because we don't know the killers, you know?
We found that very, very many of those who came found the telling, just the telling in a way, a very cathartic, a very healing thing.
So that's the South African example, which is not perfect by any means, but definitely follows the model where there's a tackling of truth and accountability with these kinds of stories. So if you think about accountability, this includes everybody who actually participated in crimes, but also those who actually peddled the oppressive narrative. So also those who adopted the Zionist narrative. There is an oppressive force to that, and they have to hold themselves accountable. And something that I talked about when I referred to this man, Amygdala, is that Zionism peddles the fallacy that there's a left to the Zionism and a right to the Zionism, but there isn't. There is no spectrum. It is only cosmetic. It maintains an illusion of some kind of humane discourse, but it's all within the settler colonialist framework. And we've learned this through the Oslo Accord, through every step of the way, pretty much. The actual quote-unquote left created many more settlements and tortured and killed, etc., and imprisoned more Palestinians than the right. Not by choice. I mean, both sides would choose to do it, but merely by the fact that the left was in power for the beginning of the state's history until 1977. So that is a fallacy that there is a left or right. So, and the most radical notion in Israel, you have to understand this, it's kind of mind-blowing, is equality. So much so that there is a special commission or a special unit in the Israeli intelligence that would investigate anybody who challenges the Jewish character of the state. So if you are only interested in equality for all, you are a threat to the state of Israel. So we move on from truth and accountability to cessation of hostility and equality and justice. And I'd like to present a little model that I did for an article, which the article I called Israeli Occupation for Dummies. And this is a kind of graph that I presented where on the very top you see a status quo. Then if you go to the right, you see an Israeli provocation, which is usually kind of masked in some way. We see a protest by the Palestinians. Israeli security forces respond with force. Palestinians retaliate because a lot of times they are pressured to retaliate by the population. So there's a lot of different forces working here, of course. The Israeli right-wing demands retribution. Israeli forces engage, either in a full-scale or not a full-scale operation. The balance of those killed, injured, arrested, tortured Palestinians versus Israelis is ridiculous. Thousands versus 1 or 2 Israelis. Then, of course, there's mounting international pressure. This is outdated. This is when Obama was president. Now I'm sure there's not going to be any international pressure. So we're in a very, very dangerous times for Palestinians. And then we go back to the status quo of occupation. Every time Israel grabs more land and expands. This is a model that I did regarding fear and anxiety. I don't know why it's a little bit, went down a little bit, but we'll discuss it. And this is pretty much how I explain the Israeli population's complicity with what is going on. If you've studied a little bit psychology, you know of a terminology called fear conditioning. What goes on is, in very kind of short, is that two stimuli are coupled together. So you are conditioned to fear something that is coupled with another stimulus that is either painful or dangerous. For example, if you go in your backyard and you see a cougar, and at the same time there's a full moon, the next time you go out and there's a full moon, you might be scared with no cougar there. Okay? And then, if you keep going out to your backyard and there's no cougar, you'll extinguish that fear. Okay? And so the first brain region that's involved in the actual fear responsivity is called the amygdala, and the brain region that inhibits the amygdala fear response is called the prefrontal cortex. Interestingly, in PTSD patients, the amygdala is very primed, it's very active, so it finds fear in a lot of different things that are maybe somewhat related to an early trauma, but the prefrontal cortex is compromised, so they can't extinguish that fear, okay? And so after extinction, you go to the normal state. However, there is something that's called reinstatement, where if you have already that fear circuitry of the cougar, let's say, and the full moon, you can, and you extinguish that fear. If you are exposed to the cougar again, outside of your backyard, you'll be scared of your backyard again. Okay, that's called reinstatement. In short, that is the general circuitry that I talk about when I talk about population, and how the population in Israel is there's constant fear-mongering. If you've ever lived in Israel, you read the newspapers, the regime constantly fear-mongers the population. Bibi Netanyahu or Benjamin Netanyahu has decided that Iran is a mortal threat, right? Constantly hammering this in. They're going to nuke us, they're going to bomb us, we have to bomb them. The Palestinians are at the gates, the Lebanese. There's always something, and Israeli Jews are susceptible to this kind of fear-mongering because they've been exposed to it for so long, and because the whole essence of the state is built on anti-Semitism. So constantly, there's this joke, what is the commonality between all the Jewish holidays? Anybody? They tried to kill us, we beat them, let's eat. So that's how this circuitry works. How does the Israeli government actually do this? So first of all, they focus on an act of violence or resistance and call it terrorism. Okay, so what is this terrorism? These people are just jumping out of nowhere and detonating themselves, and there's never a context presented. It always seems so irrational, and these people are crazy, and what are they doing? Because the truth part of the equation is kept out, right? So that's a technique of fear-mongering. Reminding the public of some atrocity in the past. In Israel, there's constant Memorial Days. Memorial Days this fast, and Holocaust Memorial Day, and Remembrance Day for the soldiers, and the Six-Day War happened here, and 72, 73. Constant Memorial Days remembering the people who died for us, and rehashing stories about, atrocities in general. Shifting attention to inflated threats, like I said, the Iran obsession. Appeal to some past glory, nostalgia, the might of the kingdom of David, all these different things. And also rewarding aggressive behavior. So recently there was a soldier who shot an incapacitated Palestinian. His name is Elor Azaria. Literally, summarily executed the man on tape, clear as day, and he's a hero in Israel. He goes to rock concerts and everybody's like clapping for this guy. So this kind of behavior is actually rewarded. You got a slap on the wrist, but that was merely for international audience. The fifth part of this list that I constructed is breaking down barriers. So rage does not necessarily lead down a single path, and we'll go back to the first model, right? There is the path on the top. Victims of abuse can cope with their trauma in two ways. They can either channel their rage toward weaker elements in society, and in so doing perpetuate this cycle of abuse, the one that goes round and round: reward, offensive aggression, resource acquisition, which is expansionism or prestige. It could be different resources. Especially when you have the back of the hegemonic force, right? Zionism definitely promotes this. Or they could stand up to their abusers who are stronger than them, face the hegemonic force, but you have to pay the price. You are ostracized by the society. So the first option of picking on the weak is easy and can be a solitary endeavor. Victims become abusers and in so doing feel empowered. The second option of fighting one's oppressors poses a greater challenge and requires courage, resolve, and social skills, as abusers are usually stronger and more formidable than their victims. So now you can see how collectivism plays into this. For this purpose, victims must join forces and collaborate with fellow victims. That's why segregation is such you can see it in every settler colonialist society. You constantly segregate. That's how you fight resistance. In so doing, they break the cycle of violence by refusing to become bullies themselves and holding the bullies accountable. So to break free, Jews must abandon, Zionists must abandon the settler colonialist and inherently unjust Zionist ideology and adopt what I see as the true spirit of Judaism, which is a much more multicultural spirit which looks at Judaism as a religion, not as a race. There's promoting leadership, and here I'll just stress the intersectional approach and how important it is. And finally, I'll end with something hopeful, is how to actually build empathy and creativity. And this is the final kind of neural model that I'll present to you. If someone is trapped in a fire, it's not enough to take them out of the fire, you have to actually treat them, right? And that's what empathy, creativity, and a rehumanization does. If you look at the brain and how it works, there's a left side and a right side. This is extremely general, but it's correct, and you'll get a picture. The left side is very strong in categorization. You are all humans. I know this because I know humans have eyes and noses and hair, etc. But my right side looks at this man and then this woman, and they're different. And what's different? And this nose is this size and this shape and glasses and whatever. Okay, so the right side is involved in actual differentiation. Left side, categorization. If you constantly segregate, that right side of the brain is not functioning. Only the left side, and when only the left side works, that's where a process of dehumanization happens, because all you do is categorize. All the Palestinians have a camel, and they ride to work, and they drink tea, because you saw it in a kindergarten book. But if you meet enough Palestinians, you know that they're human beings, just like you and me. But Israelis can't do that, because there's walls, constant different walls and checkpoints, and a whole system that segregates. So that's what I have for you today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.